Welcome to Chapter 11, focusing on treaties, part of the Dr. Anna Mamikonian Mysteries. In the Istanbul Library's legal wing, Anna requests the Kars Treaty Collection. The librarian hesitantly unlocks a steel cabinet, revealing dusty folders labeled 1920 to 1923. The first folder contains confidential GNA operations documents. These notes confirm troop movements into Armenian territory without a formal declaration of war, suggesting GNA violated international legal norms. Evidence shows the GNA was not an internationally recognized state. The still existing Ottoman Empire was the only legal state, meaning GNA lacked sovereignty to wage war, violating international legal norms. GNA forces crossed the Armenian border without provocation. British intelligence confirmed coordinated operations, and the Armenian government never consented to the incursion, nor was a diplomatic warning issued. A British complicity file reveals a UK telegram allowing GNA eastward advance, British officers embedded with GNA units, and the UK blocking Armenian appeals to the League of Nations. Armenia sent urgent diplomatic messages seeking assistance, but no allied power responded. The Armenian army was heavily outnumbered, forcing civilians to flee toward Yerevan. The GNA War Crimes Report documented forced deportations and the systematic burning of villages. Armenian officers were executed without trial. These actions amounted to purposeful ethnic cleansing, though the GNA denied responsibility. Militarily cornered and surrounded by hostile forces at Alexandropol, Armenia was without food, allies, or reinforcements, forcing the country to negotiate the treaty under duress. The Alexandropol Agreement was signed in December 1920 under duress. Armenia ceded 60% of its territory and was forced to completely disarm, negotiating without any leverage. The treaty is void because the GNA was not a recognized sovereign state, and only sovereign states can sign binding treaties. The Ottoman Empire still existed, meaning GNA lacked essential sovereignty. The treaty is illegal due to coercion. Armenia was under military occupation, and international law forbids treaties signed without free consent. No neutral witnesses were formally present. The Treaty of Kars contradicted the internationally recognized Treaty of Sèvres, which was never legally replaced. Since the Treaty of Lausanne excluded Armenia's borders, Kars lacks legal standing. The GNA was merely a political rebel faction, not a government or successor state. They lacked the authority to inherit treaty-making powers, and insurgent groups cannot legally act as diplomats. Further evidence of illegal invasion includes GNA using unauthorized Ottoman Empire weapons and having embedded foreign fighters. This weapon usage violated post-World War I armistice agreements. British complicity is evident. The UK informally recognized the rebel GNA, provided diplomatic cover, blocked Armenian appeals to the League of Nations, and isolated Armenia by monitoring Black Sea trade. Bolshevik forces invaded Armenia simultaneously with the GNA, coordinating behind the scenes. Armenia was caught between two invading armies, with the Bolsheviks' quote, protection, meaning occupation. A secret pact between Moscow and Ankara coordinated actions against Armenia, excluding Armenian representatives. The agreement allowed Bolsheviks to occupy Armenia and the GNA to seize Armenian land. The Bolsheviks demanded Armenia join the Soviet Union, threatening political leaders with execution. The Red Army quickly occupied Yerevan, forcing Armenia to accept Soviet rule. The Kars Treaty commenced in October 1921 between non-state actors, Turkey and Soviet republics. Armenia was intentionally excluded, making the unjust treaty one imposed by force. None of the treaty signatories were sovereign. The GNA was unrecognized, and Soviet Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia signed as puppet governments or under occupation. The treaty is legally void because the GNA was not a recognized sovereign state, and only sovereign states can sign binding treaties. Since the Ottoman Empire still existed, GNA lacked sovereignty. The treaty is legally void as Armenia signed under military occupation. International law invalidates treaties signed under coercion. Occupied states and puppet governments lack treaty authority. Armenia lost 60% of its land, including the Kars province and the strategically important Surmalu region. Mount Ararat was illegally transferred, effectively erasing Western Armenia from maps. The human cost was immense, with over 200,000 Armenians forcibly displaced. Villages were emptied, cultural sites destroyed, and survivors fled to Yerevan and Tbilisi. This amounted to a second genocide. The United Kingdom quietly endorsed the Kars Treaty, viewing Turkey as a buffer against the Bolsheviks. Britain ignored Armenian protests and framed the unjust treaty as providing, quote, stability, helping to conceal the truth. Moscow celebrated their territorial gains, using the treaty to legitimize their illegal control. Armenian dissent was suppressed, and scholars who objected were subsequently arrested. The GNA immediately declared a great victory, using the illegal treaty to claim state legitimacy. Their propaganda framed the territorial seizure as a national liberation, ignoring all Armenian suffering. The GNA's military victory legitimized their authority to Moscow, proving them an effective regional partner. Territorial gains facilitated the secret Bolshevik GNA agreement. Internationally, there was silence. The League of Nations failed to intervene, Western powers were exhausted, and the Armenian diaspora lacked influence. No official legal challenge was filed. Armenia was internally weakened by a civil war, and the Russian Civil War distracted a key potential ally. This internal strife left Armenia vulnerable, unable to fully defend its borders against the GNA attack. Only recognized sovereign states can sign treaties. The GNA and the Soviet republics were not sovereign entities, meaning non-state actors and puppet governments cannot create binding legal agreements. Treaties signed under military threat are invalid. Armenia was under occupation when signing, and the absence of free consent legally nullifies the agreement. This extreme coercion violates international law norms. The principle of territorial integrity states' borders cannot be altered by force. The GNA illegally seized land, and Soviet Russia enforced the treaty, violating all established international law principles. Legally, the Ottoman Empire was the only existing state. The GNA had no succession rights and could not legally transfer territory. Insurgent groups cannot inherit treaty-making authority. The Kars Treaty lacked essential Armenian consent, as Armenia was not represented during negotiations. Without an official signature or ratification, a treaty lacks proper representation and is void. No major world power recognized the GNA or the Soviet republics that signed the treaty. International law requires state recognition for binding treaties, rendering the entire agreement legally void. The Treaty of Kars cannot supersede the Treaty of Sèvres. Only internationally recognized states can legally amend treaties, and Armenia never formally agreed to amend Sèvres. Sèvres remains the last legal governing agreement. The Treaty of Kars could not supersede the Treaty of Sèvres. Only internationally recognized sovereign states can legally amend treaties. Armenia never consented to amend Sèvres, making it the last legally binding agreement. Anna's final conclusion is that the GNA's illegal invasion forced Armenia to sign under duress. The treaty was signed by unrecognized non-state actors, violating international law by using force. The Treaty of Kars is fundamentally void. British complicity, Bolshevik forces, and Turkish aggression guaranteed Armenia's defeat and the loss of Western Armenia. The Treaty of Kars merely formalized this profound geopolitical injustice.